One of the great sleeper hits of 2019, A Plague Tale: Innocence returns with the release on PS5, Xbox Series S and X to give players a way to play the first entry in the series ahead of its sequel in 2022. Developer Asobo Studio produced a real surprise with Plague Tale. Here we have a heavily story-driven stealth puzzler in a similar vein to The Last of Us, with some real technical highlights. The entire project is built on an entirely in-house engine, but it's hard to believe to look at it. It has some truly cutting-edge effects like volumetric lighting, beautiful materials supplied through Quixel Megascan, and of course the key ingredient to its gameplay, rendering a huge swarm of rats well in excess of 5,000 on screen. The swarm of rats isn't just for show. For Plague Tale, it's a huge dynamic interplaying with the way you manipulate light to carve a path. Orphans, Amicia and Hugo have to navigate abandoned farms, sewers and swamps, warding off vermin by setting up torches, or using a slingshot to drop lit chandeliers. The game proved taxing on PC as a result when it was released, and for console, well, Xbox One X represents the best way to play on last gen, delivering a respectable 1440p resolution at 30 FPS. For a look at the next generation release then, easily the biggest upgrade is the push to 60 frames per second. But there's an extra twist to this. Check this out, on Xbox Series X and S, you also have a 120Hz output mode, a first for the game on console, and entirely absent on PlayStation 5. On paper, quadrupling the frame rate over last gen's 30 FPS is a huge win, but in reality, just how close do Xbox machines really get to 120 FPS? And otherwise, is it a solid 60 FPS lock for the standard play on PS5, Series X and S? Are there any other visual upgrades over last gen? And last of all, just how drastically are loading times improved? Let's find out. Plague Tale is, let's say, a broadly linear experience. You scavenge the environment for materials to craft new and better gear, again very much like The Last of Us, but most of the challenge is in defeating the puzzle right in front of you. The positive side to a linear design, well, a lot of its best visual features, the lighting and shadowing, are baked in to save on performance, while still producing pretty great results. And so the core visual makeup on PS5, Series X and S has ended up being broadly the same as last gen machines, though with some curious changes. So let's cut to the comparison first with the best example of last gen, Xbox One X, against the newer Series X. Now a heads up here that everything you see on the Series X side on right is identical to what PS5 produces. In image quality and visual settings, they get the same package, but this shows just what upgrades you get from the older machines. Chief among them, of course, is the bump to 60 FPS, doubling the refresh obviously in side-by-sides here. But look close and you can pick out a few others. Okay, so first up, resolution for Series X and PS5 is at 2560 by 1440, much like the One X release. This is backed by TAA, temporarily reconstructing to a 4K image. But yes, the resolution stays the same. It's all to make 60 FPS possible. The other clear upgrade for newer machines, as you can see on Series X in this case, is the addition of motion blur. Camera movement now adds a velocity-based blur, missing on One X, and you even have per object blur on characters running independently of the frame. Combined with 60 FPS, this gives motion a more fluid appearance. It's one of the best motion blur implementations I've seen in a while, and as a plus, it even disguises the ghosting artifacts of its TAA method, on the whole working well for Plague Tale's grey overcast aesthetic. Motion blur easily goes in the plus column for me in this case. It works, though there is no way to turn it off for those that aren't keen. Keeping to the cross-gen comparisons, yes, most settings are visibly identical to the One X version. Textures, depth of field, and light shafts are extremely close. That said, Xbox Series X, and by extension PS5, do run with high-grade shadow maps as you can see across the ground here. We get clearer, more defined outlines on the new wave of machines. Also more subtly improved is the ambient occlusion, adding more defined pockets of self-shadowing on character jewellery, hair ringlets, and more. It's a thicker self-shadow for Series X, and certainly a higher setting than One X could push. There is one curveball here you may have already noticed. Draw distances on grass are notably downgraded on newer machines. I've noticed this mainly in cutscenes, but gameplay too. The rendering of grass is reined in on Series X here, and likewise for PS5, which I'll get to in a moment. Compared to One X, the distance at which grass fills in is lowered, dropped a preset or two. It's not clear exactly why. Possibly it's needed to factor in 60 FPS, perhaps it's an oversight. After all, the base PS4 and Xbox One versions run at a lower grass setting than One X, and so possibly the next-gen code used those as a starting point. All hypothetical, but it's clear One X keeps this advantage in the console space even over much more powerful hardware. Grass is fuller, richer on the older platform, but yes, it misses out on the high-grade motion blur, shadows, and ambient occlusion. Next up, it's time to give PS5 some attention, and Series S of course. Here we have a three-way comparison, and to stress again, PS5 and Series X are identical in their setups. Both push a native 2560x1440 image with the same settings for grass, shadows, ambient occlusion, and beyond. There's nothing to split them. Now, of course, Series S is the outlier of the three, being endowed with a third of the GPU power of its more powerful brother. Impressively, it still targets 60 FPS much like the other two machines, but Series S does it by rendering at a lesser native 1600x900 reconstructed up to 1080p. Now obviously this gives it a much softer image as a result, though 60 FPS is the target here. And as a kicker, it even keeps the newly added motion blur effects of Series X and PS5. It's a solid looking release on all three then. Now, Series S suffers a few other cutbacks to target 60 FPS that bear mention here. The draw distance setting is dropped for a start. Check this out as we walk to the apple tree up ahead. Series X and PS5 each render more grass further ahead, while Series S trails behind. Nothing colossal, but it's a preset down. Series S also uses the lower grade shadow maps, and also worse AO method of the One X version, as you can see in the shot of the courtyard. So expect softer outlines to shadows, but nothing too impactful in general play. I think Series S looks great otherwise. You'll be hard pressed to find issue with it on its own terms. The turnout on PS5 and Series X isn't exactly dazzling. The settings changes won't blow you away, but there is obviously that ace in the hole with performance. We have 120Hz support on Xbox machines of course, but getting to even 60 FPS on what was such a taxing engine in 2019 is a real win, and by and large PS5, Series X and S all get a solid grasp on it, with some exceptions. So first up is the PS5 edition, which I've got to say locks to 60 FPS more or less constantly, with very rare moments dipping under. No 120 FPS mode here, but this at least works. Adaptive screen tear is used in some scenes, but bizarrely enough, not others. So for example, you have this tutorial mission in the woodlands where tearing runs up and down the entire screen, with a small drop into the high 50s. But then later on you have a farmland area where tearing is practically absent all the way through, which does suggest VSync is engaged, but then we also have drops to the mid 50s as well. Very strange. These sub-60 drops are very brief and unusual on PS5, it's worth stressing. It's literally these 2 points, the tutorial woods and the farmland, that account for drops in gameplay for the first 2 to 3 hours, and the rest of it is a locked 60 experience. There are some points in cutscenes where small issues crop up, again fully V-synced, but the core experience really is 60 FPS and that's job done. From handling the swarms of rats to navigating foliage-dense areas, it just flies. It justifies having PS5 set to 1440p to an extent, and we're left with a solid rendition of the game. Plus, as a huge bonus on PS5, we have adaptive trigger support. Now, in my experience, this doesn't translate to every game perfectly since it really needs L2 and R2 buttons mapped to important tasks. But for Plague Tale, you have the slingshot pulls on R2, and running as well, with haptic feedback mimicking the footsteps. So for this game, it really adds a satisfying resistance to the trigger and ranks as a genuine highlight of the PS5 release. Next up is the Series X, first in the 60Hz mode. Now this again pushes past the 30fps cap of last gen to deliver a 60fps experience with adaptive screen tear very rarely on show. Drops are incredibly rare, just like PS5, but are still possible. Most curiously, the Series X drops into the mid-50s region at points where PS5 is perfectly smooth, and vice versa. So for example, remember the tutorial mission with the tearing on PS5? It's perfect on Series X, and likewise the farm area runs without a hitch. So on approach, this seemed like the best way to play, but then later scenarios like this puzzle, while fleeing a local village, just seems to suddenly drop on Series X, where PS5 ran perfectly. So it's all very strange, and this can happen for cutscenes too. Some drops appear heavier on one machine than the other, and then it flips the other way for other scenes. Putting all of this aside, PS5 and Series X are superb ways to play the game at 60. The drops into the mid-50s are brief and rare, as I've mentioned, and as far as comparisons go between them, it's not clear why one scenario runs better on one machine than the other. Still, the point is they're optimized for the majority of play anyway. Moving to Xbox Series S, meanwhile, we even see the weakest of the three put in a pretty decent performance at a native 900p and 60fps. Most of the time it's right on target, with the tutorial section dipping more so than PS5 with tearing. The only real mark against Series S is in cutscenes where character close-ups tend to V-sync and drop into the 40s at points, but nothing that affects the flow of gameplay itself. There are some one-off points where it drops, but on the whole, very impressed. Series S is well optimized for 60fps. It may drop more aggressively than the other two machines, but most of these are confined to cutscenes rather than gameplay. Okay, so the big question remains, how do the Xbox consoles handle the game at 120Hz? Well, right off the bat, I can say all visual settings and resolutions are identical to the 60Hz mode of each console. So that's 1440p native for Series X and 900p on Series S. All this 120Hz mode really does is unlock the frame rate from 60. It's removing the 60fps cap to let it run however it may, with a wide range of results, and constant tearing as well, as you can see in slowed down footage. Bearing in mind we have drops under 60fps already, its clear performance isn't exactly optimized for double that refresh. In comparison on Series X against the 60Hz mode, core visual settings are identical, 1440p native, the same shadows, lighting, all of it. Though note here that due to the limits in our capturing tools for high refreshes, the capture here is set to 1080p. Still, it gives you an idea. Clearly, the inclusion of 120Hz is just incidental, but how does it actually perform? Well, as a result of the constant screen tear, putting a frame rate graph on the footage for precise analysis is impossible. However, we have a workaround for this one. We can verify the exact refresh update using the LG CX OLED TV, in this case filming the screen with a camera to show the TV's on-screen FreeSync display. All of which means we get a rolling frame rate update via the TV itself, and with a little smart editing, we can make a side-by-side of Series S and X like this. Just keep an eye on that refresh in the corner. Also, we have to stress the console output needs to be set to 1080p for the LG CX to give accurate readings this way, but it doesn't affect the results. In reality then, both consoles run at a range of around 60 to 120 FPS. It's the full gamut. The Woodland tutorial at the start is actually a really great stress test. Just walking straight ahead puts Series X between 65 and 80 FPS, while Series S runs at around 5 to 10 FPS lower on average. Looking up at the sky obviously helps matters, but it's still in that ballpark and rarely even touching the 100s. Of course, indoor areas fare much better. You get between 90 and 115 on Series X in less complex spots, and at around 80 to 100 FPS on Series S, again up to 10 FPS lower for the weaker machine. So the 120Hz mode on Series X isn't exactly everything it could be, it's just removing the 60fps cap with few other optimizations to really make it sing. That said, there is a big advantage to it: VRR support. For those that have a supporting TV, the variable refresh rate mode on Xbox makes a stealth 120Hz mode actually a truly neat extra. It'll feel smoother than the 60fps at least, and give the most feedback possible from the machine at any point. It's surprising to see Series S holding up reasonably well too. Again, it's rendering at 900p natively with no visual changes. It'll look fine with VRR, but it does have a lower baseline FPS reading to work with. The final test then is in loading times. Now I've got to say load times are fairly infrequent for Plague Tale. They're mainly planted in the game to bridge each chapter, but can be quite long as well. It's great news then all round for the new machines. Starting up a new game, you're getting a 15-second load screen overall, with a split-second difference between PS5, Series X and S. We see a dense, complex woodland area to start, and all three get to it in just over 15 seconds. The real advantage? Seeing the 1X version on the bottom right. 1X takes a whole 58 seconds to reach the same point, almost 4 times the weight of the newer machines. So yes, that faster SSD storage really counts for a big leap in this case, though again, the game streams in the world seamlessly after that point. This is my first time playing a Plague Tale Innocence, and what a way to start. Certainly the 1440p picture may be a tad soft on first viewing, and I can see an argument for a 4K 30 mode. But still, the 60fps gameplay is fluid on PS5 and Series X with the settings Asobo Studio have chosen. And of course, Series S puts in a solid result too here. The real surprise though is that 120Hz modes are again included on the Xbox consoles but not PS5. It's a useful extra on VRR enabled displays, but for PS5 it may need specific software updates to work, rather than enabling at a hardware level as with Xbox. For my tastes, this isn't really the sort of game that truly demands 120fps. Devil May Cry 5, yes, Warzone, definitely. The pace of a Plague Tale is slow enough though that it isn't really a deal breaker to miss it, but still it's a plus for Series X and S owners, excepting you have VRR in place. All of which tease up the sequel to come in 2022, A Plague Tale Requiem. As a sequel built for just PC, PS5 and Xbox Series platforms, and a cloud-based Switch version no less, I'm expecting great things. Where Innocence has its roots in last-gen console design, with impressive results to be fair, the next chapter has the freedom to really go all out, and I can't wait to see where it takes the series. But that'll do it for this one. If you did find this analysis useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.